I call the Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Chairman, look, there are a number of points that can be made about this bill. I think the clause 2, the commencement clause, is one which, around which there could be a little bit of debate, whether it's appropriate to bring it in force so quickly, or whether, in fact, we should wait just in case the Prime Minister changes his mind again and decides whether he wants yet another flag in there. But as I think some members have argued in the House, actually he could probably do that anyway, so maybe changing the date to a set date rather than tomorrow or the next day is probably unnecessary, because as I think most members are aware, this bill doesn't do what most people think it does. What it does is scrap the current 4 and say the Prime Minister and Cabinet can put any 5 in that they want. Now, I've heard during the debate some interesting discussions on that. I've heard some Bush constitutional approaches from Gareth Hughes in particular. But I just want to say to that member that if Parliament wanted the red peak flag in here, the red peak.
Point of order, the Honourable Nick Smith. Mr Chairman, we are debating just clause 1 and 2. Earlier in the week, the member speaking was very strict about keeping to items being solely around the provision in the House, and I think the House should be consistent.
Point of order, Mr.
Well, I don't
Chairman.
think I need any guidance at the moment. What I understand is clause 1 and 2 are fairly wide. I haven't adjudicated whether or not. I haven't felt that the member's been wide of the mark yet, and of course that decision is solely mine. Thank you.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Trevor
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, are you going to admonish the Minister for bringing up an irrelevant point of order and questioning your judgment?
Whether I do or not is over to me. I don't intend doing that at the moment. I'm not going to be instructed by my fellow presiding officer. He sails close to the wind himself on many occasions. Let's just continue with the floor which he currently has.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I was trying to explain when I was so rudely interrupted, Mr. Chairman, as I was trying to explain, this bill, in fact, leaves the Governor-General on the advice of the Prime Minister the timing of when to assent to it. So that is a choice that can be made in clause 2. The timing is a matter for ordering council, and the timing of when that occurs is the advice. But more importantly, there is a debate as to whether that timing should be earlier or later, just in case the Prime Minister decides to slip in another flag rather than the ones that are there. There's a pretty important, pretty basic point which I want to ask the Attorney about, and that is the title, the use of the word referendums in the title, and it's a question of whether our level of English is slipping by using the word referendums instead of the traditional referenda. And so there's a question. Well, people, look, I'm not going to be responsible for slipping standards amongst members of Parliament and the use of English in the House. And I do accept, and I think the Attorney will tell us, that referendums is a sort of a lower level alternative use in a number of dictionaries, and it is becoming acceptable. But when we're talking about titles of bills in Parliament, there's a question about whether we should stick to the higher standards, which the Attorney has generally been supportive of, as far as he is. And I'm wondering whether maybe we could get an amendment drafted up to drop the ums and put an R in instead. Drop the ums and put an R in instead. And what that would do would be give us a title which is something more reflective. But I think to be fair to do that, we would also have to include another subclause in the bill which changed the title of the Act which we are amending, because having a New Zealand Flags Referenda Amendment Bill to the New Zealand Flag Referendums Bill might in fact be a little bit inconsistent and be a matter of trying to get that right. Colleagues will no doubt have a number of views as to more appropriate titles for this bill. My view is making the process even more biased bill is something which will be appropriate. Because what everyone knows is that this process is biased towards change. And people have not been prepared to go with the approach that's been traditionally used. Mr. Chairman?
I call the Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr. Chairman, people have not been prepared to go with processes which have been traditionally used for referenda in New Zealand, including the MMP referendum, with a yes-no question. And the question we are now facing is whether the title should include words which incorporate a recognition of that bias. And to do that, it could be the John Key vanity biased referendum bill, or it could be why won't the National Party caucus put their hands up to support John Key's biased vanity project bill, or what? Well, they don't believe it. They don't support it. They don't support him. There's been members all over the place through the debate who've refused to get on their hind legs and support the Prime Minister on this, because they know that he's wrong, and they know, especially the ones who live in electorates or work in electorates and do their door knocking, they know that if they stand up and say that they support John Key on this, that they're going to be gone burgers at the next election. And that's why, they're not silly. They're not silly. That's why they are not prepared to even debate. There's not a member on the other side who is prepared to stand up and debate on this particular clause, indicating that they think that this is the proper title. Because they all know that I'm right. They all know on the opposite side of the House that this is yet another attempt to get a failed referenda which is failing across the line. Now, it's a weird attempt. But the question we are facing, Mr. Chairman, is whether that should be incorporated in the title or not. And my view is, if this government was honest, if it was straightforward, if it titled things appropriately, then it would include in its title something which indicated that this was a way of unbalancing the pitch. It's a way of, I don't know if we're still allowed, we used to say queering the pitch. Is that still an acceptable term? It is still an acceptable term. Then, I never know with PC and all of these things these days, Mr. Chairman. But what we're attempting to do here is to put a bias on the playing field, and the question the House is facing now is whether that bias is something that should be properly reflected within this title of the bill, and whether allowance should be made in clause 2 around the commencement date for a change of mind on the part of the Prime Minister. And to be fair, that there's a balanced call there. 44,000 people indicated that they wanted a yes/no vote on a petition. I think 14,000 people made submissions to the Select Committee, and that was ignored by the government. There was a few people based in wine bars and coffee bars and other liberal establishments who got onto Twitter, and there was a decision to make a change, and we're supporting it. Anything to make this more interesting, and we're voting for the clause. But what happens if next week there is a Facebook campaign? And there's a major push for another flag to go in there. Should the commencement date of this legislation be flexible enough to take on board next week's Facebook campaign in order to incorporate a sixth design or to drop one of the current designs? Well, the bill is actually flexible enough to do it. I do accept it's there, but if the orders in council with the particular flags occurs, then after that, well, actually, probably we wouldn't. Maybe this argument is slightly unnecessary because the government could just rescind its order in council and do another order in council. But then they could have done that for this if they wanted to, if they really wanted to do it. There is a question of timing, and especially if people wanted to bring another design into the area.